To this now. It's a bleak festive season for 20 families whose loved ones died during the Eastern Cape summer initiation season. The province's Traditional Affairs Department says dehydration, hallucinations, as well as respiratory problems were some of the reasons for the initiates' deaths. I'm now joined by Contralesa Secretary General Zolani Mkiva. Zolani, thank you so much for the time this evening. I suppose there's so many things that we could ultimately talk about when it comes to this, but the claiming of 20 lives is just 20 too many.
No, absolutely. It's a very devastating blow for the institution of traditional leaders. It's not only disturbing, but it's also distorting the tradition itself. Because if a tradition that is meant to prepare young men for leadership role in the community and society in general, they end up dying during the rites of passage from boyhood to manhood, then it becomes a disaster. In fact, I think we should be amongst the first to acknowledge, as the institution of traditional leadership under the stewardship of Contralesa, that the level of deaths which are happening from one season to the other have reached grotesque proportion, to the extent that we, as the institution of tradition, we should be the first to say this is a disaster, and therefore we do need an intervention which actually can mitigate and arrest this disaster from continuing and unending. So I think we have arrived at that point, because 20 young people to die just in a summer season is too much many to comprehend. And we are short of words as to how do we explain to the nation that something of this is happening under our watch, not because it's our own doing, because the majority of those 20 kids that have passed on have died in the bogus initiation school. It is as a result of criminality. But we continue to make the call that we've been making, that we must join hands with all the state institutions that ought to work with us, the police, COGTA, the Department of Health. And we've been saying, Arabile Ndagakumete, from time to time, that this thing needs a proper planning, to the extent that, as Contralesa was saying, let's institutionalize the initiation schools. Let's formalize them. Let's make them part and parcel of the annual performance plans from a point of view of the plans of the state working with the institution of traditional leadership. In that way, we are able to do troubleshooting, because when you have plans in place, you know that you've got budget for monitoring, you've got budget for security, you have all the necessary resources to ensure that you prevent any disaster of this nature from happening. So that's where we are. And I think time has come for what we are putting forward to be actually considered and be implemented.
Okay. This is a firm note from yourselves then as Contralesa, Zolani, but why have you not then been instituted? Who or what is ultimately holding you back from being institutionalized in order to be able to create a safer environment for these initiates?
Look, the parliament passes the laws and the government administers those laws, in the sense that each law that has been passed by parliament ought to be costed, and then budget is linked to that. And regulations are also put into the equation to implement such law. But what has been happening with the institution of traditional leadership is that they are not necessarily the schools themselves. The schools are not necessarily regarded in formal ways or official ways, so to say. So when we say institutionalize them, we want them to be formalized, like you have formal education system. And when you have a formal education system, then there is a budget vote which is passed by parliament. So we're saying equally for the initiation schools themselves, both season, the summer season and the winter season, we must put budgets aside. Not that the government is not putting money into the equation, but it is ad hoc, the manner in which it is done. We only start working on the eve of the initiation season. But what we're saying, we must make it part and parcel of the budget plans of the state, and we actually institutionalize the initiation schools on their own. In that way, we will be closing ranks. We can't do it on our own because we don't control the budget of the state. We are only holding our position of custodianship insofar as being the owners of the rituals and the customs. But when it comes to the support function of pulling resources together and actually budgeting, there we don't have budget for that, especially when it comes to issues that relate to security, monitoring, and other requisite resources that are required, like vehicles. Some areas are so remote that you would need drones to actually monitor what is happening there. And this is what criminals use to go behind the back and above the heads of the communities. And they operate in the most far-flung areas, which are difficult to access. So they are doing this as a form of a subculture, and they are employing tactics of human trafficking in doing this. 7 of those children, I can confirm, from the OR Tambo region, passed on in a bogus initiation school. And I'm sure you have also heard about threats of extortion and so on and so forth. Some of those things, they also add impetus into the escalation of this criminality. So I think in the main, it's criminality, but we can't deny the fact that some children are dying in the normal legal initiation school because of dehydration. There is a lack of capacity which needs to be built, but also is the arrogance of some of the people who don't understand the implication of actually forcing the children not to drink water. So that's why we have taken measures in some instances to do training workshop, so that even if some people who are in this initiation school are illiterate or semi-illiterate, we're able to conscientize them about some of these issues that are related to dehydration, which actually becomes a causality of death in some instances. So I'm saying the state must come together and ensure that we pool resources and it becomes a standard operating procedure, that there is a budget for the initiation season. That is what we are calling for, and I think the sooner we do, the better. The disaster, when it happens, it does not become a disaster for Contralesa or the the institution of traditional leadership. It's a disaster for the country.
Sure. Fully agree. How do we monitor these bogus schools thus far?
We need to enforce the laws, but we also need the law enforcement agencies to be on the ground throughout the season. There has to be police visibility, working together with the communities, because police alone will not solve the problem. We as the communities, we are unarmed and we're dealing with armed gangs in some instances. So I think the security of the first instance is communities coming together, traditional leaders themselves, but also people who are assigned to ensure that the initiation schools are protected. Then the police must come and hold hands with us, not in a piecemeal fashion where they come in for an hour and go back. We need to station police in all the areas that are prevalent. And we know where are the hotspots in terms of these deaths. And OR Tambo and certain sections of the Alfred Nzo district are the hotspot areas. Of course, this year, we have seen 2 of those boys being passing on in the Nelson Mandela Metro, and I think 1 comes from Amatole region. And these numbers are fluctuating, but they are always in the 20s, going to the 30s. We are hoping to bring this down to 0. There has to be 0 tolerance. There shouldn't be any death in the initiation school unless it's a natural cause. But for now, these are not natural causes, because the causality is what happens wrongly, wrong management, and the criminality that happens.
Zolani, you've spoken about an intervention, conversations with police, conversations with government as well with regards to this and the state as well. Are any of those being heard? Have you been able to organize a conversation with any of those? Have you put those forward as something that should be happening? Is there a potential date ahead even for any of those meetings to happen?
Arabile, there is a working relationship that we have. both as Contralesa, as houses of traditional leaders, as COLTA, as police and health. But what needs to happen is the consolidation of that work to a point wherein it finds an expression in the regulations. At the moment, it is more ad hoc. That's what we are saying. And in that way, sometimes we struggle to have the right amount of resources on the eve of the institution, simply because it is something that is treated in an ad hoc fashion. And in that way, it makes it defeatist, our approach, because we are unable to plan ahead of time. And one other thing, in a province like the Eastern Cape, given the history of these fatalities, by now we should be having a full-time unit that actually look into the management of the initiation season. It should not just be a committee that meets once in a while. Given the enormity of the problem, by now I think we need to have an instrument that actually is charged to oversee these seasons, and they work from January to December to ensure that they anticipate all the problems and they can resolve, because prevention is better than cure.
Yeah.
All the time we'll be expected to respond when death has already happened, as if we can't plan properly. It's not that we cannot plan properly. That's why we are calling for the institutionalization and the formalization of the initiation schools. In that way, we are convinced that we will eliminate the issue of the deaths and fatalities. Actually, the nation is only aware of the deaths, but there are other damages that are happening, which are not communicated to the public. Some children actually lose their manhood, and they then tend to commit suicide only after they come back from the mountain, simply because of the criminality that ensues in some of these bogus initiation schools. So working with police and having a unit which is discharged with the responsibility of managing the initiation school under the stewardship of traditional leadership, we will be able to alleviate this nonsense.
Zolani, I'm going to ask you to educate me here for a second. Initiation has been happening for hundreds of years. This is not new. We've had deaths happening at a lot of these initiations for years. What's so different now? Why has this conversation, as stern as you've given it to me right now, which I believe is totally correct as well, why has this stern conversation not been happening in the past? Why have these solutions not been put forward in the past? That is perhaps my question mark here.
Look, Arabile, during the old dispensation, when there were TB-VC states and self-governing territory, there was absolute order when it comes to the management of the initiation schools. It was isolated cases where initiate died. For instance, the example would be lightning. But there was nothing of this magnitude which was happening. People are abusing democracy and constitutionalism of the new dispensation. I'm saying they are abusing because the advent of the deaths in the initiation school has actually taken root in the new dispensation. Yeah. And the numbers have been growing from one year to the other. If you can make a research, whether it's a desktop research or you can speak to people who are doing work in this sector, you will see that actually the problem took root right in the new dispensation, especially from 2000 coming to the 2020s. So it has not been there. So there has been a clinical management during the old order, but I think people, they are abusing democracy to the extent that where traditional leaders used to have absolute authority in terms of their functions and duties, they are now doing as they wish. For instance, an initiation school could not take effect without authorization. Today, you have a situation where someone sleeps today as nobody, but he wakes tomorrow and he declares himself as a traditional surgeon. That's where the problem is. And yet, there's been standards of how one actually graduates to become a traditional surgeon, from a traditional nurse, learning from his father, learning from his uncle, until he is certified and introduced to the traditional authority that this person is now certified. Now it's a free for all, and people are just using this ritual, this very sacred ritual, to make money, and that's where the problem started.
Zolani, I think there's going to be so many questions actually being put forward as well. I can imagine that the families have certainly put forward a lot of questions as well to yourself as well as to Contralesa as a whole. I certainly hope these conversations are being had. And you've put forward a very stern message. I certainly hope it is afforded to all the police, all those in charge of all this, because the losing of so many lives is certainly a no-go zone as well. So we appreciate your time as well this evening, giving us a clear stance on this one. Zolani Mkiva is Contralesa's Secretary General, of course, as we talk about the summer initiation season, which has seen at least the claiming of 20 lives then, 20 families in mourning at the very least then this evening.